So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
What brings you to the World Energy Congress?
Well, I'm here to discuss how space can be used as a source of energy in the future, delivering clean energy from space down to Earth.
Energy from space?
Absolutely.
How does that work?
Well, energy comes from space. Solar power comes from our sun, of course. And the challenge with solar, for example, today is that there's, of course, the day-night cycle, weather that gets in the way. And so we're not accessing this wonderful resource in the best place to tap this resource, which is up in space.
So how real is this? Is this sort of science fiction, or is this actually happening? Have you got a product? Is it being developed? And then ultimately, what is your timescale for rollout?
Well, actually, this topic does come from science fiction. Isaac Asimov, the famous science fiction writer, wrote about it in 1941. And since then, the space industry has turned many things that were science fiction before into science fact over time. And this will be just like that, because we know that the technology to be able to capture sunlight in space, convert it to radio frequencies, for example, and send it down to the Earth, exists today. We've been doing it for 60 years with satellite communications. So in order to do this for delivering power, we have to scale this technology that we have today and that's in use up to a much, much larger scale to deliver megawatts and eventually gigawatts of power back down to the Earth.
So when you think of a space agency, you don't think of energy. Why is a space agency undertaking this?
Well, this topic of energy from space, or otherwise known as space-based solar power, has been around for a long time, about 50 years. In fact, in the late 1960s, the idea of putting solar panels in space and then converting that power down to a wireless beam of power and sending it down to the Earth first came about. This was, as people were preparing to go to the moon. And it's been something that has been theoretically and even technically possible. It was looked at by NASA in the 1970s during the last oil crisis. But the challenge has always been the economics. It's not been economically viable because it's been very expensive to do things in space, to send things up in space with rockets and to put things together in space has been historically extremely expensive. Now this has fundamentally changed in the last 10, 15 years as we start to use reusable rockets and we start to use mass-produced space technology and robotics to do things in space. So the cost of doing something like this has dramatically fallen in the last years. And now this topic, we're trying to get it out of the space sector, where it's been for 50 years, into the energy sector, who are ultimately the end users of such a technology. This is a new energy source for the Earth, and we'd like the energy sector to be aware that there is a path towards making this viable in the next decade if we are to invest in it, which it's not properly happening right now.
So what are the timescales, do you think? Is this years, decades, millennia?
So absolutely not millennia or even decades, because now the idea has been around, technology has been moved on over the last decade since we looked at this in the 1970s. And as I said, the fundamental blockage was the economics, which has really changed. So the companies and countries around the world were working to deploy this already in the next decade, in the 2030s, as a working prototype, which will then need to be scaled up, of course, if it's going to contribute significantly towards our 2050 goals. But even looking beyond that, we'll have the need to increase clean energy in the world substantially for the rest of the planet, which doesn't enjoy as much energy access as we do here in the West today. And so this not only has a potential to contribute in a material way towards our net zero goals in the next couple of decades, but even beyond that into the future as humanity's clean energy needs continues to grow substantially.
So what are the next steps?
So the next steps really are to do more intensive R&D to really understand the economic and technical feasibility to make this work in the next decade. People are working on that around the world, and there are demonstrations being done on ground of beaming power from one place to the other. And we'll see in the next year or so demonstrations being done at small scale of beaming power from space to the ground. So there's a Japanese space agency, for example, is working on this. The US Air Force is working on this as well, demos in the next couple of years. And we'll see others start to demo that more and more during the 2020s. And ultimately, if those go well, we'll start to see the first small-scale commercially viable systems being put into space in the early 2030s, showing that there is a real business case to providing energy from space.
So you're taking this year's theme of redesigning energy for people and planet to the next level?
Yes, because this has huge potential, of course, to help with decarbonization, but also energy access. When you think about getting energy to places where there's limited infrastructure, like in Africa and the developing world, when you have the main generation infrastructure in high orbit, like with space-based solar power, you're able to deliver power where and when it's needed to essentially across the world. And so European or American owned assets, for example, in space could be used to deliver power also to the developing world with relatively simple receivers being placed in these regions where access to energy is much more difficult. So it really has the potential not just to help with decarbonization of the more developed world, but also energy access, clean energy access in the developing world.
So what needs to happen next? Is there a question of political will? Is there a question of financing? What are the steps that you need to take to make this a reality?
It's all of the above. Because this topic, as I said, has been very much an R&D topic within the space industry, it's not really been part of the conversation in energy policy around the world and the plans for investment and eventually deployment of this kind of technology across the world in our net zero path. And so all the aspects of the technology, of the social public acceptance, of the regulation that will be needed, but international partnerships, all of these are at a relatively immature stage and need to be rapidly tackled and intensified. And given the climate crisis, the emergency that we're in, we have to move not in the serial manner as we typically do business as usual by doing the technology first, getting the confidence, and then starting to talk to the politicians and regulators. We need to do everything in parallel because we want and think that this could be available as early as the next decade. And so there needs to be a wider conversation about space-based solar power as a potential new energy source. Just like we talk about deep geothermal, we talk about fusion as contributing in the future, we need to engage space-based solar power as one of those energy sources in the conversation.
Well, we'll follow you with great interest. Thank you very much for your insight.
Thank you very much.